Pay attention to how people behave around you. Not what they say, what they allow themselves to do. They allow interruptions. They allow disrespect disguised as jokes. They allow themselves to decide without checking with you. That doesn't happen randomly. It happens when the world concludes something about you. That you won't escalate, that you won't enforce, that nothing follows if they cross the line. So they cross it. Again and again. You tell yourself this is normal, that you're calm, that you're above it. But calm without consequence isn't strength. It's clearance. And once people feel cleared around you, they stop treating you like a factor. This video exists to expose that rule, to show you how harmless behavior is interpreted socially, why explanation never fixes it, and how men who reverse it don't become loud or aggressive. They become unavoidable. Here's the part most men never look at. Harmlessness doesn't survive because the world forces it on you. It survives because your mind rewards it. Every time you hold back, something inside you relaxes. Every time you don't escalate, your nervous system settles. Every time you explain instead of enforcing, tension drops. That relief is not moral, it's biological. Your brain is wired to reduce threat, not to command respect. So early on, it learned a simple rule. When I soften, things don't get worse. And anything that prevents things from getting worse gets reinforced. Over time, this stops being a decision. You don't decide to hesitate. Hesitation fires before thought. You don't choose to explain yourself. Your mouth does it automatically. You don't consciously lower your presence. Your body does it the moment tension enters the room. That's why harmlessness feels natural. It's not because you're weak. It's because your system associates compliance with safety. And safety feels good. This is where most men get confused. They mistake emotional regulation for authority. They think because they stayed calm, they stayed in control. But calm that produces no external consequence is not control. It's self-containment. Your nervous system feels stable while your position erodes. And because you feel composed, you assume you're doing something right. Meanwhile, the world is responding to a different signal. Not your intentions, not your intelligence, not your restraint, your response pattern. If your body consistently avoids friction, your presence communicates one thing. Nothing happens if you push here. That message spreads faster than words ever could. This is why understanding power doesn't fix the problem. You can read every book. You can analyze every interaction. You can explain exactly why people behave the way they do, and still be harmless. Because the issue is not knowledge, it's reflex. Your system learned to smooth situations out before they escalated, to anticipate reactions, to adjust yourself first. That skill made you adaptable. It did not make you respected. And once it's installed, it runs on autopilot. You don't notice how often you soften your tone, how quickly you clarify, how fast you move to reduce discomfort. You just feel normal. But normal is exactly what keeps the pattern alive. Because hierarchy doesn't respond to how calm you feel inside. It responds to how much resistance you project outward. And resistance is what your nervous system has been trained to avoid. This is why change feels wrong at first. Not socially, internally. When you don't explain, your body tightens. When you don't soften, your pulse spikes. When you hold your ground instead of diffusing, something in you panics. That panic isn't intuition. It's conditioning reacting to the loss of safety. The version of you that survives by being harmless depends on predictability. And predictability is the opposite of consequence. This is the trap. You keep choosing what feels regulated over what produces effect. You keep prioritizing internal comfort over external position. And because the choice feels intelligent, you never question it until you realize something uncomfortable. Your mind has been optimizing for peace, not power. And peace without leverage is just quiet surrender. What matters now isn't changing behavior. It's understanding where this reflex came from. Because once you see how it was installed, why it was rewarded, and why resisting it feels unnatural, you'll realize the real conflict was never with the world. It was always with the version of you that learned how to stay safe. This reflex didn't appear out of nowhere. It was reinforced, not in one dramatic moment, but through hundreds of small corrections that taught you what worked. Early on, you learned something important. When you stayed agreeable, things stayed calm. When you didn't push back, tension disappeared. When you adjusted yourself first, conflict didn't escalate. That outcome mattered, because at that stage of life, stability was more valuable than leverage. So your system adapted, not consciously, efficiently. You learned how to read rooms before they turned hostile, how to sense disapproval before it was spoken, how to soften yourself before anyone had to harden toward you. Those skills kept things manageable, and because they worked, they were rewarded. Praise followed compliance, relief followed restraint, approval followed silence. Your nervous system logged the pattern. This keeps me safe, and anything that keeps you safe gets repeated. Over time, this stopped being a strategy and became an identity. You didn't just behave cautiously. You became someone who anticipated, someone who adjusted early, someone who prevented friction before it appeared. That anticipation felt intelligent. It felt controlled. But anticipation has a cost. It trains you to move second, to read before acting, to wait for signals, to measure reactions before committing. And while that made you adaptable, it also made you readable. The more predictable your responses became, the less resistance you projected. And resistance is what slows other people down. Here's what most men never realize. The same behavior that protects you early in life limits you later. Because the environment changes, but the reflex stays. The world no longer rewards quiet compliance. It rewards clarity, friction, and consequence. But your system is still operating on an old survival contract. So when tension rises now, your body reaches for the same solution. De-escalate. Explain. Smooth it over. Not because it's wise, because it's familiar. This is why harmlessness feels justified. You can rationalize it easily. You tell yourself you're being mature, that you're choosing the higher ground. That conflict isn't worth it. And in isolation, those thoughts make sense. But systems don't respond to isolation. They respond to patterns. And the pattern your behavior creates is not neutrality. It's accessibility. People learn how far they can go with you by watching how you respond under pressure. If pressure consistently produces explanation, they push again. If it produces silence without consequence, they push further. Not because they're malicious, but because nothing stops them. And here's the uncomfortable part. Your reflex is loyal to the past, not to your present position. It's optimized for environments where safety depended on being easy to deal with. But ease is not power. Ease invites use. This is why breaking the pattern feels wrong. Not ethically, physically. When you don't soften, your system reacts. When you don't explain, your body tightens. When you hold the line instead of dissolving it, something inside you says, "This isn't safe." That voice is not intuition. It's a memory. A memory of what once kept things from getting worse. But what once prevented loss now guarantees it. Because the rules changed. You are no longer rewarded for being manageable. You are evaluated on whether you create friction, not chaos. Friction, something that makes others pause. And the longer your system resists that shift, the longer you stay locked into an identity that no longer serves you. This is why knowledge alone doesn't free you. You can understand all of this intellectually and still freeze when the moment arrives. Because reflex doesn't answer to logic, it answers to conditioning. And conditioning doesn't dissolve through insight. It dissolves through violation, not reckless violation, but deliberate refusal to respond the old way. That's why the transition feels like betrayal. You're not just changing behavior. You're turning against a pattern that once protected you. Something inside you will resist that. It will tell you you're being unnecessary, that you're overreacting, that you're risking stability. That voice is not wisdom, it's inertia. And inertia always argues for staying the same. The question isn't whether this reflex made sense once. It did. The question is whether you're willing to keep paying its cost now. The shift doesn't start with confrontation. It starts earlier. In the moment where your system reaches for the familiar response, and you don't give it, not because you planned a move, not because you're trying to assert power, but because you recognize the reflex and decide not to obey it. That decision feels small from the outside. Internally, it's violent. Your body will push back immediately. You'll feel the urge to explain, to soften, to restore balance. That urge isn't random. It's your system trying to return you to a role that once kept everything predictable. This is the first refusal, not refusing others. Refusing your own default response. Most men think change begins when they act differently. It doesn't. It begins when they withhold what they've always given. Explanation, reassurance, adjustment. The moment you don't offer those automatically, something shifts. Not in the room, in you. Because for the first time, you're not optimizing for comfort. You're tolerating friction. That friction will feel wrong. Your body will interpret it as risk. Your mind will look for reasons to undo it. It will tell you, this isn't worth it. You're being unnecessary. You're creating tension for no reason. Those thoughts are not insight. They're the reflex negotiating for control. This is where most men fold. They mistake internal discomfort for a signal that they're doing something wrong. So they retreat. They explain. They clarify. They restore equilibrium. And the pattern resets. But if you stay still, if you let the discomfort exist without correcting it, something important happens. The reflex loses authority. Not all at once. Gradually. You begin to realize that the discomfort doesn't escalate forever. It peaks, then it fades. Nothing collapses, nothing explodes. The danger your system predicted never arrives. That's the first crack. You learn viscerally that you can survive without self-erasing. And once you learn that, you can't unknow it. From the outside, nothing dramatic has occurred. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't posture. You didn't make a scene. You simply didn't rush to restore balance. But internally, the hierarchy just shifted. Because the version of you that exists to smooth things over just lost its monopoly. This is where behavior begins to change. Not intentionally, but structurally. You pause before speaking. Not to choose words carefully, but because you're no longer obligated to fill space. You stop explaining things that don't require explanation. Not as a tactic, but because you no longer feel responsible for how others receive you. You allow silence to stand. Not as a power move, as a refusal to manage discomfort that isn't yours. And something subtle begins to happen around you. People slow down, not because you demanded it, but because the old patterns stopped functioning. They don't know why yet. They just sense that the usual levers aren't producing the same result. This is where real change starts. Not when you project confidence, but when you remove predictability. Predictability is what made you manageable, and manageability is what kept you in place. This refusal is quiet, invisible to most people, but it compounds. Each time you don't soften, the reflex weakens. Each time you don't explain, the old identity loses ground. Each time you tolerate tension instead of dissolving it, you teach your system a new rule. I don't have to disappear to stay safe. That rule changes everything. Because once your body accepts that, new behavior becomes possible. Not forced, not rehearsed. Possible. And the world responds to what's possible long before it responds to what's declared. This is why nothing dramatic needs to happen yet. No confrontation, no announcement, no performance. The shift is already underway. You're no longer reacting to preserve the version of yourself that kept things smooth. You're allowing a different version to exist. One that doesn't rush, doesn't correct, doesn't negotiate its own position. This is not power. It's the removal of submission. And once submission is removed, something else has room to surface. Something people notice before you ever say a word. The first thing that changes isn't how you act. It's how people respond. Not immediately, not dramatically, but subtly enough that you question whether it's real. Conversations feel different. People don't interrupt you as quickly. They hesitate before pushing a joke too far. They pause, just slightly, before deciding without you. You didn't demand this. You didn't correct anyone. You simply stopped supplying the response they were used to. And when a system loses a predictable input, it recalibrates. Most men misunderstand this phase. They think respect arrives because they projected confidence. That's not what's happening. What's happening is uncertainty. People were used to knowing how you'd respond. Now they don't. And uncertainty forces caution. Not fear, caution. The kind that slows behavior down. This is the moment where many men sabotage themselves. They feel the shift and rush to stabilize it. They joke, they explain, they soften, because part of them still wants things to feel smooth. But smoothness is exactly what made you irrelevant. So the work here is restraint, not outward restraint, inward restraint. Resisting the urge to reinsert yourself into the old pattern. You'll notice something else too. Some people pull back, not because you became cold, but because they no longer feel entitled. They were comfortable when you were predictable. They're cautious when you're not. This isn't loss, it's sorting. Every hierarchy sorts when behavior changes. Some people adjust upward, some drift away. Both outcomes are information. And information is leverage. You'll also notice pressure tests. Small ones. A comment meant to provoke explanation. A question designed to pull you back into justification. A subtle challenge framed as concern. These aren't attacks. They're probes. The system checking whether the old response is still available. This is where presence matters. Not what you say. What you don't rush to do. You don't need clever replies. You don't need sharp comebacks. You just need to not default. When you don't explain, the probe fails. When you don't rush to reassure, the pressure dissipates. And once enough probes fail, they stop coming. This is when your presence begins to carry weight, not because you asserted it, but because people learned there's friction now. They can't move you as easily. They don't know exactly how far they can go. And humans hate guessing wrong in social hierarchies. So they adjust. Voices lower. Language tightens. Assumptions change. Not because you demanded respect, because you stopped making disrespect convenient. This is also where you'll feel temptation. The temptation to use the shift, to lean into it, to assert dominance prematurely. That urge is dangerous, because the power here is structural, not expressive. The moment you try to display it, you reveal it. And revealed power gets challenged. Quiet power gets accommodated. So you let the world do the work. You stay consistent, not rigid. Consistent. No dramatic swings, no performances, just the absence of your former compliance. And slowly something locks in. People stop expecting access, stop assuming explanation, stop treating you as background. You're not louder, you're heavier. This is when rooms feel different around you. Not tense, attentive. Not because you speak, but because when you do, it matters. And when you don't, nothing collapses. That's the signal. The signal that you're no longer filling space to stay included. You're occupying space without asking. This phase is fragile. If you relapse into old habits, the system snaps back instantly. Predictability returns. So does manageability. But if you hold the line, not aggressively, just consistently, the shift stabilizes, and once it stabilizes, it doesn't require effort anymore. This is where most men think they've arrived. They haven't. They've only removed the penalty. What comes next is capacity, not visible, not loud, but unmistakable. At a certain point, power stops feeling like effort. Not because the world suddenly became fair, but because you stopped feeding it the behaviors that made you easy to handle. You don't argue anymore. You don't correct misunderstandings that don't matter. You don't rush to explain what you meant. And something strange happens. People hesitate around you, not because you're loud, not because you're aggressive, but because the old levers no longer work. They test you with silence. You don't chase it. They test you with disrespect. You don't react. They test you with approval. You don't lean in. That's when the hierarchy shifts. Most men think power comes from asserting themselves. It doesn't. It comes from withholding access. Access to your time. Access to your emotional reactions. Access to your availability. The moment people realize they can't provoke, flatter, or rush you into movement, they start treating you differently. Not consciously, but instinctively. Because humans don't respect what they can move easily. They respect what resists without effort. This is where most men fail. They improve their posture. They sharpen their speech. They learn the right words. But internally, they're still reactive, still seeking confirmation, still tied to outcomes they don't control. So the power collapses under pressure. Real authority is quieter. It's the absence of urgency, the refusal to oversignal intention, the comfort with letting others misunderstand you. You don't correct the narrative. You let time do that. You don't chase validation. You make people feel the cost of losing access to you. And when rejection happens, because it will, you don't dramatize it. You treat it as information. Rejection doesn't mean you weren't good enough. It means you were positioned as optional. So you stop offering yourself as an option. You withdraw cleanly. No bitterness, no speeches, no closure rituals, just absence. Absence forces recalculation. People only understand value once it's gone. And while they're processing the void, you're not spiraling. You're upgrading. Not loudly, not publicly, privately. You refine your standards, you sharpen your discipline. You reduce your tolerance for anything that dulls your edge. Because power isn't built through revenge, it's built through replacement. You don't try to prove them wrong. You become unreachable to their judgment. Eventually something flips. The same people who ignored you start watching. The same people who dismissed you start asking. The same people who felt comfortable disrespecting you become careful. And you don't acknowledge it. Because acknowledgement reopens the door. You don't need them to admit anything. You needed the position to change. And it did. This is the final shift. You stop trying to be understood. You stop trying to be liked. You stop trying to be included. Not because you're bitter, but because those needs no longer run you. Your presence becomes heavier because it's no longer reactive. Your silence becomes unsettling because it's deliberate. Your movements become decisive because they're not emotional. You don't announce boundaries. You enforce them by behavior. You don't demand respect. You make disrespect uncomfortable. This is what it means to stop being harmless. Not cruelty, not chaos. Control. Cold, internal, unshakable control. You didn't become louder. You became harder to move. And once that happens, you don't need to threaten. You don't need to posture. You don't need to explain. People feel it. They adjust without being told. That's when you know you cross the line most men never reach. The line where power stops being something you chase and becomes something others respond to. If you're still here, it means you're done playing the old role. Done shrinking to be acceptable. Done explaining to stay safe. So if you're ready to keep building this version of yourself, the one that isn't manageable, predictable, or easily replaced, then like the video. Not as support, as a signal. Subscribe if you're done being harmless and ready to move through the world with quiet authority.